Within the Houston battle, within the scope of the largest ever invasion in human history, put together by the Sino-Russian coalition invasion forces, with China obviously being the largest contributor for reason of its enormous total forces under arms, its gargantuan industrial base, including war industries, as well as also its massive aggregate hardware for all of its millions of forces it had under arms when combining its reserves for its military and its massive paramilitary elements, all combat grade and equipped. As these forces, the Russian VVS and its powerful contribution to this battle with its bomber squadron of Tu-22Ms, and it's also its Su-27 squadron with some of the aircraft equipped with the Kabini electronic warfare jamming system, many combat occurrences by the end of the first hour were either still ongoing or had begun or were wrapping up as it pertained to the fighting that had occurred at Ellington, one of the absolute first major occurrences of combat within the scope of this large, massive battle. As the PLA's enormous artillery forces from the 83rd Artillery Brigade of the PLA's 83rd Group Army were actively rocketing and shelling the city with 155 millimeter howitzers from their self-propelled PLZ-05 howitzers, which were the 155 millimeter, and the 122 millimeter PHL-11s, which were an upgrade from the PHL-81 rocket projecting platform, which was a armored truck-based platform with newer systems equipped within. As the PLA's active duty artillery forces were equipped with all of the newest hardware available, these PHL-11s made an enormous contribution, as there were a total of 56 of them firing from their PHL-11 battalion within this grouping of the artillery forces, as this was their headquarters battalion, their support battalion, and their other battalions, one of which even had to fight against armed reactionary civilians by surrounding and destroying them early on, as they typically were not used in such a role. They utilized their troops as infantry to achieve this task, as well as some of their heavy weapons and direct fire roles, as they had total ISR dominance, and this would not be an issue for them, as the rest of their forces, including their very powerful A300 300mm rocket battalion, along with the other howitzer battalions, were firing en masse deep into the city's inner city, slamming groupings of armed reactionary civilians, erasing entire neighborhoods and sections of the city in one swift stroke, and forcing the Brigade Engineer Battalion, which was just beginning to set up for its mission to guard the international airport, as it had received orders just before the invasion broke out to do so, having its area, its bivouac site, being massively shelled and rocketed, with many of their vehicles and troops being lost in this attack, with the remainder fleeing to the international airport. Currently en route, the first hour in, about to arrive, as armed reactionary civilians in surrounding neighborhoods, along with local paramilitary alphabet SWAT-like elements, had risen up and tried to repel an incoming attack from two different PLA mechanized infantry battalions, supported by a armored battalion of the 11th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, with another of their armored battalions within the Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, the 11th, surrounding and destroying a large grouping of armed reactionary civilians, approximately 780 within this pocket, before then proceeding to move to reinforce the 58th Combined Arms Brigade as they prepared to cross the San Jacinto River and destroy the second of the 156th, one of the additional battalions brought in to support the defense of the city here in the Channel View area. Channel View had a mix of many industrial sites relating to energy industries as well as chemical industries and disposal even, and also there was a lot of commerce type areas within Channelview as well, and marinas and also neighborhoods that had their own boat launches within both the Lake Houston area as well as the Galveston Bay, whereby the river had flowed directly into. By the mouth of the river, a massive battle was erupting between the armored battalion of the 58th Combined Arms Brigade itself, which would be supported by the artillery battalion of the 11th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, firing their 155 millimeter shells in massive salvos from their 56 different howitzers, as the 56 different rocket projectors of the PHL 11 Battalion of the 83rd Artillery Brigade would likewise be firing in support, as these arrows indicate, as this is all the different areas they're firing upon. All of this part of the grand strategy of destroying not only American military units, but effectively killing two birds with one stone, as it was supporting also the capture of the NRG power plant conducted by the Mechanized Infantry Battalion that belonged also to the 58th Combined Arms Brigade, while supporting the flanks. Another Mechanized Infantry Battalion had at the opening surrounded a grouping of armed reactionary civilians that had essentially risen up within their neighborhood with arms in hand, and they had rapidly been surrounded and destroyed to allow the armored forces to pursue their main objective, which was the destruction of the 2nd of the 156th Battalion, brought in with their heavy equipment by trains. This battalion had 4 different mechanized infantry companies within it, as it was part of the 256th Infantry Brigade combat team. It was a relatively infantry heavy asset element, and they did have one heavy company. They also had their support company, and they had their headquarters company, which their headquarters and their support companies were essentially responsible for the logistics and command of the forces, especially as it pertained to the HQ, which encapsulated the command elements over the entire battalion, as this battalion was a little bit larger than some of the other battalions that belonged to the 278th ACR. As they had one extra combat company, this force had been spread out in different bivouac sites located within the Channelview area, which partially saved their entire unit from total destruction at the opening barrages. As artillery was in high demand early on in the conflict, many areas were being indiscriminately showered with artillery to destroy any notion of resistance cropping up in said areas, as the records of where high concentrations of likely armed civilian resistance would be had been noted and tailored into the war planning, as China had insidious ways of obtaining certain information through their cyber warfare arm and their AI data processing system that could process all of the data acquired and utilize it for the analysts to piece together the actionable intel to go after specific targets. This also applied to all of the American military units throughout the map, as all of the data relating to the leasing agreements and or rental agreements as it pertained to the different properties or hotels and other areas had been acquired by the cyber warfare arm, and it was between the state and federal regimes funding these certain bivouac areas, including even the detraining area in the Sugarland Industrial Park, which had been used by the artillery forces as well as many of the heavy forces operating in this particular theater of operations. As the Mechanized Infantry Battalion of the 11th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, positioned just to the north of Lake Houston, had destroyed over 400 armed reactionary civilians within the first hour before moving on against the airport. They would clash very soon with the remains of the Regimental Engineering Battalion. This was a Regimental Engineering Battalion of the 278th ACR, which was headed in their direction. As these forces had moved into place, many fleeing armed civilians and refugees as well, non-combatants, had fled through the area and informed these forces, as had been the norm in many of these instances, and had let them know that Hostile forces were on the way, as they were very close as they materialized on their CCP regime properties located across the San Jacinto River in the industrial area in an old abandoned factory that had been purchased by the CCP regime for the storage of heavily armored vehicles and their associated logistics, insofar as what they needed for their first assault before the headquarters battalion would then be able to send its logistical assets to resupply them as the campaign went on. And the main supply forces, which were the 83rd Support and Sustainment Brigade, had heaps of supplies and were in the process of moving them into the West Houston Airport, which would become a megafob for the later colonization operations in the city when it came to the occupation, as the PAP forces, upon destroying the 3rd Squadron, would move in and establish a heavy security presence with their 2 battalions, working with the PLA logistical forces in establishing this new fob. However, by 1 a.m., combat was in full swing in the northwest. It was also going on within the south. It was going on in the southwest. It was going on by the coast in Texas City, Texas by this point, and also in the east of the city, still ongoing with much more to come, as also the 1st Squadron was already beginning to try to engage a mechanized infantry battalion. However, this would fail miserably, as a Tu-22M would be utilized in a tactical role in support of this battalion and completely obliterate many of these forces, as the 1st of the 98th Cav was also with them as a 2 battalion-sized element with the 1st Squadron, a very heavily armored fist indeed, but they would not be able to withstand such potent air power, as well as local strikes from Su-27s providing close air support to their PLA brethren. Also, additional PLA battalions would reinforce the Mechanized Infantry Battalion in an all-out armored battle within the southeast of the city. As the battle up here would also be a very urbanized battle and a fight over some key bridges in the area for these forces to cross, as this armored battalion moved in to prepare to possibly cross behind them as an armored reserve with their very powerful Type 99A main battle tanks, as well as their QN-506s, which also equipped the anti-tank forces of this battalion, although its main battle tanks were the Type 96B, but those were also highly advanced and very potent tanks, just a step under what the Type 99A was when looking at the technical specifications. It was quite possibly the 2nd best tank in the world, possibly tied with some others for that title. As these forces had moved and the civilians had fled, other civilians were fleeing other areas, as the combat engineers had moved in to seize I-10, where it crossed the Galveston Bay area, the massive bridge here. They seized this end of the bridge, and local civilians had fled by boat and tried to cross to the other side, as the mechanized infantry had left this area where they had materialized on CCP properties to seize the energy power plant, and supporting this action was also the action going on which was against the support battalion, which was at its forward logistical point, which was there to strategically, logistically support all the defensive operations in the city from this point at their riverine supply depots and steel mill and lumber yard that they had established their temporary base of operations as a forward supply point, similar to what was going on with the HHT, their headquarters of headquarters troop over the entire 278th ACR, in its position just south of the downtown area, as logistical forces were the major target, including what had occurred at Ellington, a complete and total rout and slaughter and razing to the ground of that facility. Missile strikes would hit these forces in conjunction with artillery, as well as massive ground assaults, as taking out logistics beyond just the communications and ISR network was also a very high, absolute top priority for the invasion forces, as well as seizing critical infrastructure and controlling the major highways all throughout their length within this key node. I-10 was absolutely the top priority, as the external invasion forces, upon arriving, would get onto I-10 and race into the American southeast before fanning out to support all of the Trojan operations going on in that specific region. As the armored battalion attacked this area, as these forces had been bivouacked throughout different hotels and parking lots in this area, that had partially saved them from immediate annihilation, as the time-on-target method was being used by some of these batteries, where multiple batteries would fire all their same systems in one specific area at the same time, causing enormous destruction, as well as the howitzer fire from the artillery battalion of the 11th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, and the howitzer fire also coming from the artillery battalion of PLZ-05s, self-propelled guns that were part of the 83rd Artillery Brigade as well. All of this fire coming into this general area to support all of the actions that were occurring as these forces smashed their way into this area, and the civilians were fleeing across the Galveston Bay from marinas and from their own home-based boat launches with anything they could fill in their boats in a rapid manner as these combat engineers approached the area. And artillery was firing from the forces of the 58th Combined Arms Brigade. These civilians were trying to get out of the way of the combat. However, they did not understand that within fourth-generation warfare, there was no safe front line from which they could seek shelter and which the country could mobilize from, as enemies materialized all throughout the map on their CCP regime properties, and there was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, at least within this city. All the intelligent people had evacuated as soon as the first shells began to land, and they didn't look back, and they took tertiary routes to escape. And those who stayed, who were unfortunate enough to be trapped in the city, but were likewise intelligent, had found other ways to survive, such as going underground, as the city did have its own underground, and many would seek solace and shelter as refugees, living the life of a sewer rat just to escape the combat. As this battle was now underway, massive artillery strikes from the PHL-11s were falling all throughout the area, saturating the American forces where they stood, as well as armed civilians transiting the area in a hurry, trying to get where they were trying to go, and being trapped within such a disaster, such a catastrophe, as the total, complete destruction of many areas within the city by these PHL-11 strikes, in tandem with the heavy munitions strikes by air, missile strikes from sea, and soon to join it, the Caliber Club K and YJ-18C supersonic cruise missile container-disguised quad missile systems that were placed all over the nation and would pop up and fire in different salvos, as there were 10,000 of these container-based missile systems from Russia and China placed strategically throughout the nation, and timed to go off in different volleys, as targeting data could be updated and changed, and it also had the psychological effect of keeping missiles airborne as long as possible as it pertained to the cruise missiles from these containers. As the sea-based missiles were already wreaking havoc from the Renhai-class stealth cruisers, as well as also the Song-class Type 039 subs, which were diesel-electric subs that had sailed from their bases in the Caribbean and began to launch their YJ-18B submarine-launched cruise missiles at all manner of land targets. The destruction was now rampant. It was ubiquitous. It was all over the place. As the forces moved in, the armored forces came with their armored infantry troops to support their armor, as well as also their anti-tank forces in the form of their highly advanced QN-506, which fired the very potent dual-purpose anti-tank, anti-air, as it could be a short-range air defense missile, the QN-502C missile, and they also had 70mm laser-guided rockets. They had their own loitering munitions, the S-507s, which were tiny loitering munitions and lacked their overall range that the much larger and more destructive CH-901A possessed, or the Russian Lancet III. These were smaller and could be launched from the vehicle, but could do relatively decent damage and could annihilate an infantry squad or cause damage to lightly armored vehicles. And they had their own quadcopter recon asset, just like every other vehicle crew and squad possessed. These were very advanced systems and highly destructive to vehicles, buildings, and groupings of troops, with their 30mm autocannon and 7.62mm coax machine gun as well. Full of sensors, full of very high-tech equipment. This was a killing machine for sure. As well as the loitering munitions in the form of the CH-901As that sought out targets and destroyed them, with the very powerful HJ-08 man-portable anti-tank weapons as well, and the rocket-propelled grenades, which were produced in such enormous quantities, the numbers are unquantifiable, as these Type 69s and their associated anti-armor and anti-personnel rockets were all throughout the Chinese forces, whether regular military or paramilitary. They were handed out liberally and used in enormous numbers as the forces enjoyed the weapon as a reliable and trusty side arm to their regular small arms, as they could do massive damage when they carried these into battle, not just against troops with their anti-personnel round, but also against vehicles as well. As the Type 96B main battle tank was amid the fighting and was perhaps the second best tank in China's arsenal, and was top-notch and literally only one step below what the Type 99A was, as it only had some minor additional features that the 96B didn't possess. The 96B was still the cream of the crop and equipped many of the active duty PLA's armored battalions. Their VN-20 was the absolute brand new, state-of-the-art, state-of-the-industry infantry fighting vehicle with its new HJ-12E anti-tank missiles, which had excellent range and very strong armor penetration capabilities. This vehicle had armor akin to a tank armor of a light tank, with extra added ERA or NERA applique armor plating added to it for even more additional armor protection, with its very powerful 100mm main gun and very dangerous, destructive 30mm autocannon, and their 7.62 by 54mm turret coaxial weapon. And the trusty Type 89A was a step up from the older Type 63 armor personnel carrier, which equipped many of the reserve forces, mechanized infantry, and armored infantry and combat engineer battalions. However, the Type 89A was the vehicle of choice as far as an armor personnel carrier for the mechanized infantry, combat engineers, and armored infantry troops of the PLA's active duty military forces. As these forces were again moving into this area, going to the map, the chemical disposal facility here has a concrete wall abutting the sea, where the river, the San Jacinto, empties out here into the Galveston Bay, which is technically the ocean, as there's docks for cargo vessels, and the piping for chemicals runs along this wall and into this building, as well as a crane for unloading and offloading cargo. These are some of the buildings associated with the plant, offices, and others. The fence has been torn up as these vehicles had smashed their way through and just drove into this area. This is a armored infantry platoon. This is an anti-tank platoon. And this is a logistical vehicle moving in to drop off additional ammunition as they're firing their longer range QN-502C missiles across this section, as this is a 1.5 mile by 1 mile map, 1.5 miles east to west, 1 mile north south. Cruise missiles are coming in from the subs and from the Renhai class, the CJ-10 land attack cruise missiles, as well as the YJ-18B submarine launched cruise missiles, which one is launched at this headquarters platoon of this mechanized infantry company of the 2nd of the 156th, who is the unit in this area. They had been bivouacked at many different hotels and parking lots in the area, as this was once a thriving commercial and retail area, and like as in small businesses, hotels, offices, and such. Small businesses like restaurants and everything like that, bars. Now it had been laid waste by the 122 millimeter rocket strikes doing their time on target, where multiple systems target the same area. As the battalion had 56 of these, they targeted 2 areas between both battalions, firing at 2 different areas at the same time, while the 155 millimeter howitzers are doing similar and smashing areas right here and this area off map, as there was another company off map. The support company had gotten mixed up in all of this destruction as they were moving into the area, as the American strategy had been, as far as local commanders, as they had been told that the PLA forces were approaching, as the local fleeing civilians crossing these bridges to inform them before the artillery had really begun in earnest to destroy them and tear them apart. They had been informed that PLA forces were moving into the area, as on this map, as they came into the area, armed civilians and non-combatants fled into this area, and others were moving up and down all through the area, and they had been informed, as they had no ISR capabilities, they had lost all their satellites, their drones, their spy planes, everything, because all of that had been destroyed by missile strikes, including the anti-satellite missiles, which took down the satellites, and the tactical cruise and ballistic missiles that destroyed their drone and aircraft bases, as well as airstrikes early on in the campaign. They had no ISR capabilities to speak of whatsoever at all. Electronic warfare jammed any tiny small drones they might have even possessed at the company level, if they even did. So not every American company even had a drone. And as this was the case, the Kabini jamming the redundant systems that were not either drone, GPS, or internet connected, and therefore could function, the Kabini jammed the radios and redundant systems, including portable radars, and they had no capabilities to see anything that was going on, and they had to rely, sadly, on transiting civilians, both combatant and non-combatants. The area in this mouth of the river, where it empties into Galveston Bay, was full of non-combatant vessels, everything from yachts to fishing boats to speedboats, trying to flee and get across into this area, fleeing from marinas, and some that were already in the ocean at the time had fled upriver and abandoned a speedboat and fled into the city this direction. As the PLA forces approached, of course, to the south, as well as the Combat Engineer Battalion was moving into that area and scared these civilians away in their boats, many fleeing with anything they could carry. However, they fled into a battle zone, and many would get caught in the crossfire. Even this unfortunate speedboat that would actually be destroyed by American fire, as it's completely surrounded in green, as they did also take some fire from the PLA forces, but this one was destroyed by the PLA as it fled up the mouth of the river here and was hit by the crossfire and destroyed. The PLA wasn't deliberately targeting them unless they tried to fire back like the men in these boats did. These had no combatants in them. Some of them were armed, but they didn't fire because they knew that if they did, it was mean certain destruction, even though the crossfire was coming their way anyhow. And they tried to get out, but they were destroyed by the time they got here, as it's encapsulated in red. This one's been destroyed and sunk, and this one, because it needs to be understood that these vehicles, including the VN-20, are firing 100 millimeter, 30 millimeter, 7.62 by 54 millimeter anti-tank missiles, the HJ-12Es over across at these vehicles. They're firing 12.7 millimeter heavy machine gun fire, and the PLA did take some casualties. This battle was massive. The scale of this battle was massive, this battalion-on-battalion battle, because the artillery coming in to support the PLA's attack, as they had to cross water. So to cross a water barrier against a force that's holding the other side is always going to be a challenge, no matter who you are, no matter if you have ISR dominance or not. When the forces actually meet, you have to take the bridge, and to take the bridge, there's going to be one hell of a fight. And as these boats were fleeing through the area, they all got destroyed bit by the crossfire. And these were deliberately hit by loitering munition strikes and fire coming from land, as these fired their laser-guided rockets across the channel here, and they were hitting these vehicles, including the headquarters vehicles behind these tree groves right here. And these troops have been KIA'd, along with loitering munition strikes coming in at the opening. All of these are destroyed by loitering munitions, by fire coming from the QN-506s, firing their missiles, their very powerful missiles, their dual-purpose anti-air, anti-tank missiles, which were the QN-502Cs, firing them over across and destroying these American Bradleys and M113s. Cruise missiles have been fired from the vessels, the subs and the cruisers, the Renhai-class cruisers, the stealth cruisers, and the Song-class subs. They were fired into this area, and this one even targeted this headquarters platoon, as this Wing Loong 2 combat drone is firing 4 of its CM502KG dual-purpose anti-ship, anti-tank missiles at targets off the map that were American targets of some of these now becoming scattered military forces. As even their one heavy company was coming in, it was being massively pummeled by enormous rocket strikes, as well as the howitzer strikes coming into the area right here. This one got the worst of both. They got hit by howitzer 155 strikes and rocket strikes, completely disabling these tanks, essentially annihilating them, as they were hit by so many munitions at once. I mean, they didn't even stand a chance. They were completely destroyed as they were trying to move to the area to reinforce their troops. As these were being hit by missiles fired from the stealth aircraft, the J-20 squadron with their accompanying combat drones, their fighter drones. These were fighter drones that actually had gun pods, and they had air-to-ground missiles. They're firing their KD-88 air-to-ground missiles. So were the J-20s, as they had limited air-to-ground munitions. They were primarily for the air-to-air role. They're firing their gun pod, their 30mm gun pod as well, along with these KD-88 missiles, which were fired much further back, as these were long-range standoff land attack missiles, and they were smashing into these vehicles, destroying them right off the bat. Although these vehicles tried to fire back along with their dismounted troops, not every vehicle had dismounted their squads by this point, and as they rolled into the area from their bivouac sites further away, as the PLA was rolling into the area, that's when they clashed. But the PLA saw them first and got such an enormous lead on them, as in getting the drop on them, that they massively annihilated all these vehicles with the support from their loitering munitions, support from the air, from close air support conducted by the FH-97A fighter drones accompanying their J-20 fighters, their stealth fighter jets, firing KD-88 air-to-ground missiles at these vehicles, striking them. There was also the very powerful QN-506 anti-tank platoons of the anti-tank company of the battalion firing. There were dismounted armored infantry troops firing anti-tank missiles as well. Their HJ-08s as well as their rocket-propelled grenades. These guys were taking cover on the curb in the prone. These guys were in the rubble firing back. The Americans fired AT-4s. They fired 40mm grenades. They fired even a few javelins they had on hand, and they managed to do some damage. Even one of the Bradleys managed to get off a shot before it was destroyed, and destroyed this vehicle with the troops inside. They annihilated the entire crew and squad, as a Bradley had fired a tow at this Type 89A, as this did not have laser or IR scrambling. It was an APC. It got destroyed, blasted. This one, too, on the end, got blasted by a javelin fired from one of these troops, destroyed. But the return fire meted out on them from this VN-20, this very powerful infantry fighting vehicle, and the heavy machine gunners on these remaining APCs slaughtered these guys, along with these guys getting hit in the crossfire and destroyed, and loitering munition strikes coming in and hitting them as well. Air-to-ground missile strikes, KD-88s, slamming into these forces, fired at these vehicles and these vehicles here, with loitering munitions coming in and picking the rest off. This was highly hellish and destructive. These vehicles were being annihilated. These guys were KIA'd at the opening of the map due to being within extremely close proximity to the artillery blasts. These guys eventually all got KIA'd. As these guys ran in, they were getting fired at by these forces across the channel at the chemical plant, the disposal facility. So there was rails that also led into it. It had a dock and another set of rails. These QN-506s firing across and destroying everything with their 70mm laser-guided rockets, their their short-range loitering munitions strikes from their S-507 loitering munitions, wiping out these troops in one hit. I mean, these were destructive vehicles. As these vehicles prepared to cross, they were also firing ahead too, and at these vehicles that were on the embankment right here, as this was an embankment that went downwards, sloped down into the mouth of the river. And they were all being hit by the loitering munitions, by the heavy machine gun fire from the 12.7 millimeter. They were being hit by the HJ-12E anti-tank missiles from the VN-20. They were also being hit by 100 millimeter fire, which shredded these vehicles up with 30 millimeter autocannon fire. Same from these vehicles. Each of these was a VN-20 leading the assault, so their laser and IR scrambling would protect the vehicles behind of these two armored infantry platoons. As they were crossing, there was a tank platoon, and they were crossing together. There was a tank platoon right behind them. It belonged to the same tank company as this tank platoon, and there was two other tank platoons, the other two combat platoons that were sitting back on the other streets, and lots that were in this industrial side of the Channelview area. And as they were firing their 125 millimeter tank guns, they were annihilating these forces too, and hitting these vehicles as well. And these vehicles at the same time, KD-88s and loitering munitions came in and destroyed them. The loitering munitions, of course, being armed with heat warheads, having had been fired by the headquarters battalion of the 58th Combined Arms Brigade's dedicated drone section of their combat drones. This was two full companies. This was a whole tank company moving in with these to lead this assault, as these armored infantry troops of this armored infantry company, led by their VN-20s at first, firing their 100 millimeter cannons into these forces, causing these guys, as these forces approached, these guys were firing everything they had. AT-4s did nothing to these tanks, as they had used up all their javelins. They had to move so quick when the artillery began into position that they hardly were able to carry anything on their person if they had available ammunition. Their ammunition was already limited as far as like special weapons and items like that, so they had to use everything sparingly, but their vehicles were their best weapon because they already had their tows in for the Bradleys, they already had their machine guns mounted, they were ready and they moved into position, but they got annihilated by the concentration of sheer firepower from these QN-506s, loitering munitions, ground troops firing their HJ-08s, very powerful anti-tank missiles that can be man-wielded, as well as also their rocket-propelled grenades firing anti-armor and anti-personnel rockets, as well as their light machine guns, general-purpose machine guns, like the light machine gun being the QBJ-201, and the general-purpose machine gun sometimes was the Type 67, but they also had newer ones as well. But the forces, they were laying down enormous volumes of fire against the Americans, including the tank fire, which was massive, and the tanks could also fire ATGMs as well from their breech, from their bore, the anti-tank guided missiles, which gave them even further range to hit enemy forces, and 35 millimeter grenades, which could be launched about 300 meters at their longest range. They could hit targets out at that range. So these troops are firing enormous firepower at these Americans, who were trying to fight back with everything they had. As these troops gradually moved in to support their vehicles, as by this point they had even lost one of their APCs due to American fire coming at them that destroyed their APC. Others were being engaged by the small arms light machine gun from the M249, the Saul, the 240 Bravo, which was a 7.62 NATO, the 7.62 by 51. They had their general purpose and light machine guns too. On the American side, their Saul and their 240 Bravo, the Saul being the M249, as these were their squad-based machine guns. These two half squads were also firing a few AT-4s, which, after they had fired a Javelin and destroyed this one, these air-to-ground missiles annihilated these vehicles moving into position here. They annihilated these vehicles, and the loitering munitions came in and struck these vehicles, with the anti-tank missiles landing from not just the QN-506s, but also the VN-20s. Two anti-tank missiles from this platoon hit two different vehicles, destroying them, with 70 millimeter rocket strikes sweeping up all these troops along the bank. I mean, this was hellish. And the 30 millimeter autocannon fire from the QN-506s as well, just like from the VN-20s, 30 millimeter autocannon and 100 millimeter main gun. It just swept all these guys up. These guys were annihilated, and these loitering munitions came in with their heat warheads, destroying all these vehicles alongside of the fire coming from across the way from these vehicles, from the anti-tank platoons and the armored infantry platoon firing everything they had. And these vehicles came in to resupply them from the headquarters platoon of the anti-tank platoon. They were coming in to bring them more missiles to reload their systems so they could continue laying down heavy fire. Over on this side, on the American side, there were armed reactionary civilians in this area right here, some fleeing, hauling ass down the street, just barely making it out of the artillery fires. This pickup truck took bad damage in the back and just was barely out of the area when this heavy strategic bomber, this Russian Tu-22M, added to the massive mayhem and carnage by just flying over this area and carpet munitioning this entire area. With its munitions spreading out over a relatively wide area, they could carpet munition a half-mile wide area very nearly, and they destroyed all of this, as all of this encapsulated in blue has been annihilated by the strategic bomber, and all of this here had been destroyed by the cruise missile strike, as all these are encapsulated in red. This sea-launched cruise missile and Russian heavy strategic bomber hit all of this and annihilated everything. The very edge of the blast got this vehicle too, as all these buildings were thrown with rubble going every which way, very much like this right here. This is what the Tu-22M was doing. This is what it was capable of, alongside of the 122 millimeter massive concentrated time on target strikes, with the 155 millimeter strikes coming from two different artillery battalions, one from the 83rd Artillery Brigade's 155 PLZ-05s, and the other from the 11th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade self-propelled PLZ-155 howitzers as well, alongside of the 122 millimeter rockets, which were concentrated all in two different parts of this battlefield, with the 56 systems splitting up and doing time on targets to two different areas, saturating grid squares with their potent concentration of 122 strikes, with this Tu-20M flying right over the area, dropping massive payloads right on top of the rocket strikes. I mean, this was total destruction. Everything razed to the ground. Cruise missile strikes. Even this Wing Loom 2 flew over, firing CM502 KGs, and yes, it was high enough in the air that the strategic munitioning didn't get it. So it was just high enough. This could fly and cruise at a relatively high altitude, but it fired its air-to-ground CM502 KGs at targets off the map that were just outside of the range of the time on targets, and this Tu-22M coming over the area, as it had a wide spread, true enough, but it wouldn't get everything that was off the map, as there were armed reactionary civilians moving through this area, even a few scattered military remnants of the battalion of the 2nd of the 156. Again, this was total hell. As these cruise missiles came in, they were coming in to hit the original bivouac sites, which included different hotels and parking lots where the tents were set up, most of which were already being carpeted in the massive rocket strikes on and off map as well. This was total devastation at its worst. Some of these were support vehicles, some were armed civilians. It all got mixed up in this area as the tank company, the heavy company, was trying to move into the area to fight alongside of their mechanized infantry troops, which are trying to hold the line and prevent the PLA from crossing the bridge. Even little did they know that right below them, another mechanized infantry battalion of the PLA forces, one belonging to the 58th Combined Arms Brigade, had materialized far to their south. Not far to their south, rather, I'm sorry. But it was about several miles south, and then they had moved and captured the energy power plant with little resistance, as all they had to do was sweep away the guards and a few armed civilians that just happened to be in the area, as this unit had been trapped in this death trap fighting over this area of bridges. Although they had a coherent defensive line, even though they had to do it by word of mouth and keep their forces organized, and that was a hellish task in and of itself, as it was extremely difficult, and they had to maintain being close together so that they could communicate up and down the line, lacking radio, as the company jammed it. They managed somehow, some way to pull this off, to actually get themselves into a formation to defend the bank and hold the area of the bridge, with forces using rubble to their best advantage and actually doing some damage to the PLA forces, taking out 3 of their vehicles, including 2 with full crews inside. They had caused some relatively moderate KIAs, at least with this platoon. They had wiped out almost half the platoon. And over here, this platoon had lost its driver and gunner because its troops were dismounted at the time, were moving up, bounding and covering tactically to the end of the bank so they could continue to lay down fire and get within better range as far as hitting targets that might have been further back, as far as like their 35 millimeter grenades, rocket propelled grenades, anti-tank missiles. As again, this was a large area, a 1.5 by 1 mile area north to south and 1.5 mile east to west. This was a large area. And these fighter aircraft providing their close air support with their combat drones in hand, I mean, these were massively effective. The strafing from their 30 millimeter gun pods was decimating, not just with the vehicles with the air-to-ground missiles and loitering munition strikes, but the infantry too. The dismounted infantry were getting slaughtered. These guys even ended up trying to retreat to other rubble piles to basically do a fighting retreat, and they got slaughtered by the gun pods, as well as all of the fire coming from these guys moving up to continue to maintain fire on these personnel with their tube-fired grenades, their anti-tank missiles, their RPGs. They wanted to stay within range, even though they were coming to the limit of their advance along the embankment. But what they were really doing strategically, along with these anti-tank vehicles of the anti-tank platoon firing at them as well, laying down 30 millimeter autocannon fire from each and every one, along with the heavy machine gun fire from the Type 89 APCs, the 89As, and the VN-20 firing its very powerful 100 millimeter main gun, 30 autocannon as well as what these had, and all the 30 millimeter fire, the 70 millimeter rocket fire, the shower of anti-tank missiles, I mean, in the air-to-ground KD-88s, the loitering munition strikes, all combined along with the artillery barrage and rocket time-on-target techniques. I mean, they were decimating this area, and add in the Russian Tu-22M and the cruise missile strikes. I mean, all of this stuff just coming into this area was enormous. Even these 8 civilians who were running up the street here had been slaughtered by some of the rockets that went in this direction and slammed into this building, as there's red on this building. 30 millimeter fire smacked into it, and with the HE armor-piercing ammunition, which blasted and ripped out chunks of concrete and threw it in all directions. It was deadly debris, and also and shrapnel, and also the missiles and rockets hitting this area. They just wiped these armed civilians out like it wasn't anything. I mean, these guys, and there were armed civilians here too. There's pickup truck got blasted into 1,000 pieces, and as these guys ended up trying to cross, by the time these guys were pushing their assault, this 2-platoon element of armored infantry, this is their 3rd combat platoon, they had their headquarters further back, and the tank platoon moving up with them in one formation. They were capturing the bridge gradually, as all that was left to challenge them were these infantry that were clinging on to rubble, and they were firing at them as they gradually pressed their assault, firing until they KIA'd every last one of these guys. These guys had already been KIA'd early on as they ran into this position and were wiped out. These guys had finally been KIA'd by the time these guys got here, finishing off the rest of them, laying down in the prone and clinging to life behind this concrete abutment. They then pressed their attack this direction, while this element, this entire company of armored infantry and this entire tank company, which is a bigger prong, pressed their attack against the remaining forces who retreated over here but got blasted by tank shell fire. That was the other thing too, is all the 125 millimeter tank gun fire, which had a long range, slamming into all this, destroying armed civilians, smashing into the tanks along with the artillery. I mean, this was total hell on earth, literally. This was high intensity war, and none of the American forces were ready for it. All they had ever known, really, it was low-intensity conflicts. They'd never been fired at in this type of manner before, and they had never, ever trained for this. They always assumed that they would be the superior force, but now that they had got completely dogged and destroyed, run down by superior air power, superior ground power, superior naval and missile power, superior air power, I mean, it was over. I mean, they even the combat drone firing at targets. I mean, this was total destruction and devastation. Although this battle actually lasted because they were returning fire. The credit must be given where it's due. The Americans returned fire. They fired back. Even their tanks got a few shell fires in, but they had their lasers scrambled and couldn't really do much from where they were in their current position, but they fired shells over the top of their friendly forces to try to hit anything beyond, even though they just slammed into buildings on the other side. They didn't really do much. The tanks weren't effective in this battle, but they tried. The most effective weapons were the Bradleys and the troops that had the javelins. As combined, the Bradley had a kill, and the two troops with javelins each had kills. But their AT-4s, although they did damage, and they actually KIA'd a few dismounts with them, as again, here there were combat medics in this MRAP. This was a combat medic MRAP that was pulling up in this area as their combat medics ran up to tend to some of their KIA'd and wounded as they got behind and took cover behind this APC before running over here and checking the destroyed vehicle for survivors, and then also coming to get this KIA as there'd been one KIA out of the squad and a few wounded, so they tended to them and they evacuated them back to safer areas as their vehicle came and picked them up, and then they drove off in the MRAP. This was an ambulance MRAP. As the same thing essentially was happening over here. These guys came and checked on some wounded. I mean, there were some KIAs here. This was not by any means completely one-sided. I mean, the PLA lost some troops. I mean, but the PLA had total superiority in firepower, ISR, and everything else. I mean, like, they had total dominance, air power, everything. They eventually came around, destroyed these armed civilians that finally tried to show themselves. They tried to fire back, but they just got a lot. They got slaughtered. I mean, it was not even a competition. The VN-20s leading the pack just cut them down with 30 millimeter and 7.62 by 54 fire, and they continued their advance through this completely rubbled area as they then came around the area as they were moving north. These two full companies, the tank company and armored infantry, and crossed the bridge and destroyed these forces on the other side, including more to the just to the north, before they surrounded and made a massive pincer around this entire area before they would clear it and make sure that they got everybody and take any POWs that were even still alive, whether armed civilian or whether they were just battered military troops that just happened to survive somehow. Maybe they climbed into a sewer or a drainage pipe or something, or just were underneath some rubble that happened to save their life at the time, as these forces laid down enormous firepower on the American forces. And while some of their vehicles suffered some minor damage, minus those that were outright destroyed, the vehicles that suffered damage were still combat effective, and the very few that suffered damage that needed repairing would be repaired in due time, as they were still, again, combat effective and could still serve. And the troops that had been KIA'd, there were a number of them KIA'd, as some had been destroyed within their APCs, and some were KIA'd in the field of battle in this floodplain area, this park-like floodplain area with trees and everything for flood when the river floods, as they raced down the embankment to keep up pressure on the survivors in this area before they fled and were destroyed by all of the fire coming from the tanks, the missiles, everything. They had lost some troops, and the Americans, you know, they tried and they destroyed a vehicle here, one here, and one here, and some troops KIA'd that were dismounted, but they were totally slaughtered. I mean, it was a total rout, you know, even though the Chinese had suffered some minor casualties. Eventually, the area had been pincered and cleared, and the PLA Armored Battalion prepared for its next mission, as it had now crossed the bridges and would next rendezvous with the mechanized infantry and secure this entire area around the energy power plant, as the other mechanized infantry battalion, upon destroying and capturing the logistical area, would then press into the downtown to support the People's Armed Police racing in, as well as their additional forces from the 131st Heavy Combined Arms Brigade, who would soon be joining them in the massive battle occurring downtown, as well as also the combat occurring between the 1st Squadron and 1st of the 98th, and the Mechanized Infantry Battalion and their reinforcements from the 113th Heavy Combined Arms Brigade. Next battle would be the battle between the Regimental Engineering Battalion at the International Airport, along with armed civilians and paramilitary forces, against two Mechanized Infantry battalions and a very powerful armored battalion moving in to seize control of the George Bush International.